Hi everyone, sorry for going radio silent on you these past few months. Today I can finally explain to you where I've been, what I've been doing, and most importantly, why. What we're looking at is Solomon's Link, an isometric point-and-click adventure, where you control a pair of convicts chained together after escaping prison. I developed it together with two volunteers from our community, Max, who was the writer, and John, who took care of music and sound design. You might have seen the application forms floating around some time ago. Huge thanks to all of you who applied back then. Now, don't worry, I didn't abandon Assertion, and I'm as motivated to work on it as ever, but you've probably noticed that the game's been taking much longer to develop than I originally intended. It's clear that I've grown attached to it. I'm no longer okay with it being bad. And this has been weighing on me for quite some time now. I'm afraid that I'm sinking all this time into my very first game, which may turn out to be a complete failure. This is why, back in March, I announced to my patrons a new project codenamed Foundations. The idea was to take a break from Assertion and create a much simpler game in just a few months. This gave me a lot of time to reevaluate Assertion, while still allowing me to learn a lot of game dev skills. With Foundations, I've successfully organized playtesting, integrated music with F-mode, and tried out collaborating with other people. All with relatively low stakes, because unlike Assertion, there was no attachment there, no expectations, no people to disappoint. That's exactly the reason why I haven't told you about it sooner. I wanted to keep it a secret so as to not generate unnecessary hype. And in the end, it turned out to be a good call, because while Solomon's Link has all the features we planned, we struggled a lot with finishing most of the story. And given that it's a story-driven game, it ended up more like a technical demo rather than a complete experience. Still, if you want to give it a try, the game's available for free on Steam and itch.io, links are in the description. Otherwise, let me walk you through the whole development process. The work officially began on June 12, 2023. After figuring out what type of game we wanted to make, I prepared a little prototype. So far, the player can only walk around. The left mouse button controls the blue convict, while the right button controls the orange one. Next, I added interactions. The game was meant to include environmental puzzles, based on the fact that when one convict is interacting with something, the other can only walk within the limits of the chain. Imagine one convict having to hold a garage door open, while the other looks for something inside to lock the door in place. The last ingredient was dialogue. When interacting with something, we can prompt the convicts to start a conversation. A dialogue wheel then displays all available actions. The system was created using Typewriter, which you may remember from my Assertion devlogs. With the prototype ready, I moved on to the art, starting with the characters. Max provided me with a detailed description of the convicts, both their personalities and their appearance, so I didn't have to imagine much. These are the models I created in Blender. I went for a flat, low-poly aesthetic with not much detail. The proportions may look a bit odd because I tried to accommodate them to the orthographic projection. For example, here you can see how the projection makes the head look smaller, which I tried to account for. I then put the models in the game together with a generic walk animation, and this is how it looked like. At this stage, I also started playing around with the environment. The boxes you see have a flat color, but I used their world coordinates to project a paint texture on top of them. It's a quick way to break up the colors. I decided to give this art style a try and modeled an actual level, the loading dogs that our convicts will use to get inside a factory. Again, Max provided me with a description of the level, as well as this concept art. Since I'm not a huge fan of working inside Unity's viewport, I tried to do as much of the level creation in Blender as possible. I modeled everything as a single scene and only exported props individually if they had to be reused in multiple places. Things such as utility poles, fences, and pallets. I then put it all together in the engine and added any missing components, like lights or procedural cables hanging between poles. To avoid having dozens of materials for every individual color in the scene, I created a shader that looks up the color from a palette. The index of the color is stored using the UV coordinates of each mesh. I wrote a simple Blender plugin that automatically creates these UVs. Aside from colors, the palette also contains other information about the surface, such as reflectivity, smoothness, or even the type of sound that footsteps should make. This allowed me to use a single material across most meshes. I also decided not to use the built-in Unity terrain, mostly for stylistic purposes. Instead, I modeled the ground in Blender and used vertex colors to denote which parts should be covered in grass and which in dirt. This way I could write a simple shader that blends between the two substances according to my paint texture. The resulting edge is more organic than a simple linear blend. After figuring out the general art style, it was time for the main menu. We wanted the game to be experienced from the perspective of a detective who's analyzing the surveillance footage of the factory. So naturally, the main menu was designed to resemble a detective's office. A stack of VHS tapes is used for managing the save files, the door serves as an exit, and the options can be accessed using the case folder. When playing the game, the same folder is used as the pause menu. This way the player can tweak the settings right there in the game. When it comes to the actual UI elements, like the controls on this page, I wanted to challenge myself to make them entirely based on sign distance fields. TextMesh Pro already uses this technique for rendering fonts. So for icons, I simply imported the Material Icons font and extracted the symbols I needed. For panels and other boxes, I wrote a simple UI shader to draw round rectangles using SDF. This makes it really easy to play around with the corner radius and line thickness without having to deal with raster graphics. It also looks a bit more crispy, especially since the canvas is not flat. It moves in 3D space. Another stop was the dialogue UI, since the current one was pretty rough. I started with the dialogue gizmo. It's really just a simple quad with everything else rendered in the shader. This lets me control it with a few shader properties. To render the icon in the middle, I wrote a script that extracts information about specific glyphs generated by TextMesh Pro. This way I could easily render any icon in my custom shaders. By the way, you may notice how this circle in the middle morphs into the icon as the gizmo expands. This is a neat feature of SDFs. All you need to do is interpolate between two fields and this morphing happens organically. Here's the gizmo in action. You can see how it changes to show if and who is interacting with it. The colors also rotate to reflect the convict's position relative to each other. To make the dialogue wheel, I reused the same gizmo but changed the icon inside. It now represents the current action the player can take. It can be either play the next line, skip to the end of the current line, or leave the conversation. Most actions can also be performed by pressing anywhere in the dialogue area or by hitting space. The only exception is leaving the conversation. Here the player needs to explicitly press the button. This makes it easy to skip through the dialogue without exiting by mistake. I also updated the look of speech bubbles to use the same font and rounded corners as the rest of the game. Conversations themselves also got an upgrade. All the bubbles now move to the top to resemble a messaging app. The player can then scroll to see the entire history, which persists until they exit the conversation. At the same time, I was working on some debug tools. To give you some context, we were authoring the dialogue in Google Sheets using this template. The data was then loaded to Unity via a custom importer. So to make the writing process a bit easier, I added an in-game menu that let us immediately import and test the current version of the sheet. This way you could just grab the most recent development build of the game from GitHub and test the new dialogue without having to boot up Unity. At this point, the game was playable and almost feature complete, so I started preparing for playtesting. We had already set up a Steam page, so I just configured our GitHub pipeline to upload the builds there. Shout out to GameCI, which made this process extremely easy. I then generated a bunch of Steam keys for my patrons and began the first round of playtesting. Huge thanks to everyone who participated. We got a lot of helpful feedback. For example, people would intuitively try to hold both mouse buttons together to navigate both configs at the same time, but the game didn't allow that. I implemented this feature right away, and now I can't imagine the game without it. Sadly, not all was going great. At this point, we were 3 months into the development, already past the initial deadline. But when it comes to the game's content, we only had this one intro scene with incomplete dialogue. It was clear that we wouldn't be able to finish the entire story in a reasonable amount of time. There were a few problems that contributed to this situation. First of all, we definitely overscoped the dialogue system. Initially, I expected the game to be mostly linear, with some contextual lines sprinkled here and there. But the system we settled on was much more dynamic, with almost every conversation changing based on the context. This of course made it much more time-consuming to write. Additionally, we suffered from a lot of personal life issues outside of our control, which rendered people unable to work on the project for weeks at a time. But excuses aside, I was still satisfied with how much we were able to achieve. I checked almost all the boxes on my bucket list, so I proposed to the team that we finish up the intro scene and release the game as a demo rather than the full story. We added one more tiny scene at the beginning of the game to teach the player how to play. The game starts in the middle of a conversation. This should show the player which bubble color corresponds to which player. After exiting, the convicts remained logged to the interaction. This is perfect because it requires the player to use both mouse buttons to navigate away. If the player does nothing for long enough, a prompt shows up asking them to press L and B, but they won't be able to go too far because of the chain. For that, they'll need to move the other convict. If they don't figure out they need to press R and B, another prompt will show up. This makes sure they know they can move both convicts with corresponding buttons, which should be enough to play the game. Back in the main menu, I added the credits in the form of an investigation board on the wall. I also finally implemented saving using Safekeeper, another package you may remember from Astortion. The game is saved automatically whenever the player leaves a conversation. As a final touch, I created an outro screen displayed at the end of the demo to thank people for playing. And this brings us back to today. The game is out. The source code and all the assets are available for free on my GitHub, you can go check them out. But most importantly, I've learned a lot of things about game dev and about myself that changed the way I think about Astortion. But we'll talk about this in a future video, probably next week. Other than that, I'd like to again apologize for disappearing. People kept asking me where I was and I just keep replying with some lies about being on a break. So yeah, sorry for that. It won't happen again, I promise. I actually hated the secrecy of this project, so I'm here to stay and I'm gonna update you on everything I do from now on. Anyway, thanks so much to all my patrons for making this possible. Thank you for watching, and until next time.